Let's talk about how to modify a knitting pattern for a different yarn weight. I have gotten quite a few questions about this topic lately and I feel it is worth exploring. Modifying a knitting pattern, if you choose to use a yarn that's different than the one that's indicated in the pattern, is relevant for all kinds of knitting patterns. You can use it to modify sweater knitting patterns, shawl knitting patterns, hat knitting patterns, and of course also for sock knitting patterns. As you might know, if you have seen some of my previous videos, I have an Etsy shop where I sell my hand-dyed yarns. As of right now, I offer 3 different sock yarn bases in my shop, and 2 of them are DK weight instead of the standard fingering weight sock yarn. Does this mean that if you want to use a DK weight sock yarn that you are limited to the knitting patterns that are written for DK weight sock yarn? Absolutely not. You can modify any sock knitting pattern to fit the yarn of your choice. All you have to do is either adjust the needle size or do some recalculations. The first thing you should do in order to make the knitting pattern work for you is to make a gauge swatch. Now, I know this can be tedious and oftentimes seems unnecessary, but I can highly recommend that you do a gauge swatch for every knitting project basically. And to take it one step further, I recommend that you do the swatch the same way that you are going to knit the pattern. So for example, coming back to the example of socks, socks are usually knitted in the round. So your gauge swatch should also be done in the round, and you should make sure that it is large enough. Usually this means 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And in addition, I also highly recommend that you block the swatch, because this can change the stitch and row gauge quite significantly. Granted, this seems like a bit of work, but I can assure you that it will be worth it in the end. I have knitted lots of projects in the early stages of my knitting journey where I didn't swatch properly, and I almost always regretted it in the end. So if you want to make sure that the project is going to turn out the way you want it to, please make a gauge swatch first. Now, if you have knitted your gauge swatch and blocked it, the next step is to determine your gauge. You can use a tool like this one here from Sandnes Garn, but you can also simply take the swatch and count your stitches. So you will have to take your stitch gauge as well as your row gauge, because both are highly important, and then we can move on to the next step. So now that you have determined your gauge and it is obvious that the gauge does not match the one that's indicated in the pattern, there are several options you have. The first one is to use a different needle size. So if your gauge is not off significantly, so only by a couple of stitches, it can be worth experimenting with needle sizes. You can either go up or down depending on where your gauge sits with regard to the gauge that is written in the knitting pattern. But you have to keep in mind, if you change the needle size, you're also going to change the fabric. If you go down a needle size or a couple of needle sizes, your fabric will get tighter and firmer. And if you go up needle sizes, you will get a looser fabric. This is something very important to keep in mind, because it can negatively affect your outcome. For example, let's go back to the sock knitting example. If you go down needle sizes, you will get a firmer fabric, and this, in my opinion, is favorable when it comes to socks, because the socks are going to be more robust. Since the fabric is tighter, they are not as prone to getting any holes. But if you are knitting something that you want to be more drapey, like a shawl or maybe a cardigan, this is not going to be so favorable. So this is for sure something to keep in mind. The next option you have is changing the pattern size. Let's have a look at an example now. When I knit socks for my husband, I usually go for the size large, which means when using a fingering weight sock yarn, I cast on 72 stitches. Let's say that the gauge indicated in this pattern for a fingering weight sock yarn is 36 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So if I would cast on 64 stitches, this would result in a width of 8 inches or 20 centimeters. So it would be 4 divided by 36 times 64 is X. You are going to use the rule of 3 here, as you can see. If I want to knit this pattern with a DK weight sock yarn instead of a fingering weight yarn, I have to have a look at the gauge. And let's say that my gauge is 30 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters in my DK weight yarn. And if I now calculate backwards, in order to get a width of 8 inches or 20 centimeters, I will need to cast on 60 stitches, again using the rule of 3. Therefore, I can simply cast on a smaller size in my thicker yarn and still get the same size that is going to fit my husband. So the third option you have, if it is not going to work changing the needle size or simply knitting a different size, is to recalculate the pattern. This is of course the most elaborate version. It can be done for sure, and it is not as intimidating as it sounds, because after all you have to do is use the rule of 3 that I just showed you in the socks example, but it is a bit more work because you have to recalculate every step of the pattern. Recalculating the pattern math is easiest when the pattern is written in a way that it gives you measurements instead of numbers of rounds or rows. So a lot of times patterns say knit for 25 more centimeters, for example, and then you can just knit and check by measuring, and you do not have to recalculate. And on the other hand, if you have a pattern that says knit, I don't know, 12 more rounds, and you do have a different row gauge than the one that's indicated in the pattern, you will have to recalculate the number of rounds that you are going to knit depending on your yarn, again using the rule of 3. Let's talk about some sock knitting pattern specifics now. The vast majority of sock knitting patterns is written in a way that the stitch count is divisible by 4. So a typical sock knitting pattern for a fingering weight sock yarn would come in the sizes like, let's say, 60 stitches, 64 stitches, 68 stitches, and 72 stitches. So if you have to increase or decrease the amount of stitches you cast on, you have to make sure that you go up or down in increments of 4 stitches. And if this does not work out because you are somewhere in between, you just have to round up or down. There is another specific that you have to be aware of when it comes to socks, and that is the case if you knit a classic heel flap and gusset construction. Let's have a look at an example from one of my own sock knitting patterns, which is called the Schneeflöckchen socks. So this is a section of my Schneeflöckchen socks knitting pattern. The stitch count for the 4 sizes is 60, 64, 68, and 72 stitches. But let's say you choose to knit the pattern with a thicker yarn and that you want to have only a stitch count of 52 stitches. What do you do about the heel turn now? Let's have a look at the smallest size, and you can see that you have to slip 1 stitch, purl 14 stitches, purl 2 together, purl 1, and turn your work. Now, therefore, if you want to knit this with fewer stitches, all you have to do is take 1/4 of your stitches and subtract 1 stitch, because you are knitting the heel turn with only half of the stitches. If you have knitted socks before, you probably know what I mean. Now, taking the stitch count example of 52 stitches, this means you would have to slip 1, purl 12 stitches, purl 2 together, purl 1, and then turn. Let's also have a look at the next row. Since you want to create a symmetrical heel turn, in the first row of the heel turn you worked 16 stitches in total before you turned your work. This means that 10 stitches remained unknitted because the heel is knitted with only half of the stitches. Now you know that you will have to work 6 stitches in this row, so that you have 10 stitches remaining on the needle after you turn your work. Thus you have to slip 1, knit 2 stitches, slip, slip, knit, knit 1, and then turn. I hope you got this general idea. It is really not complicated once you've wrapped your head around it once, but I feel it's a bit difficult to explain in a straightforward way. Let me know if you have any questions about this in the comments, and I will try my best to help you. Now let's look at a couple of examples from my own knitting projects, because I tend to use different weight yarns for all kinds of knitting projects all the time, and I will want to show you some examples so that you can see that it is really not that difficult and actually a lot of fun to make the knitting pattern work for your needs. Let's look at another one of my own knitting patterns. So this is the Schneeflöckchen Hat, and it is written for a light DK weight yarn originally. However, I wanted to knit this in an Aran weight yarn for my daughter, and I simply changed the stitch count to compensate for the completely different gauge. So I made a gauge swatch and then knitted the hat in fewer stitches. I'm going to link my Ravelry project page down below so that you can see how I did that. Now, another example that I also knitted for my daughter is this sock. This is the Wildflowers and Honeycomb sock knitting pattern by This Handmade Live. And the pattern is written for a fingering weight sock yarn, but I wanted to use my own hand-dyed yarn in the classic sock DK base. So this is a yarn that's a lot thicker, and I decided to simply decrease the stitch count, and I casted on 48 stitches instead of the 56 stitches that were indicated in the pattern. Again, I'm going to link my Ravelry project page in case you're interested in how I modified this pattern. And the last example that I wanted to show you is this sweater. This is called the Mountain Mist sweater, and it is a beautiful pattern by Tin Can Knits. I knitted this in Iona wool double knit, which is a DK weight yarn, and the sweater pattern is originally written for a worsted weight yarn. So this was a bit more elaborate because this was one of the cases where I had to recalculate every step of the pattern. I couldn't simply choose to knit a different size, but in the end it worked out really great, and I really love this sweater. Now, like I said, if you have any questions about modifying knitting patterns, please leave a comment and let me know. And if you would like to know what I'm currently knitting on and what I'm currently modifying, you should have a look at this video. Until next time, bye guys!